Final panel of today's symposium is the future of the FCC. I'm not allowed to use the word old anymore, so I have a panel of grizzled veterans. If you'll notice, somebody here does not look like Larry Irving, but we are extremely fortunate that in our audience was a former FCC commissioner who at the last minute, we're not quite sure what happened to Larry. Commissioner Adelstein was willing to sit in, and we're thrilled that we can actually have two former FCC commissioners, so thank you for pitch hitting at absolutely about a minute's notice. So,
the Rob and Johnny Show redux here.
Exactly. So, purpose of this panel, as we all know, we've got a new FCC chairman, and the FCC is at its crossroads. For those of you guys who missed my morning speech this morning, this was actually our Phoenix Center giveaway about 10 years ago, which was state of the art. It was your own RJ11 plug that you would put in your briefcase, in your laptop. You could hook up to your modem. Obviously, we've come a long way since then. So, starting from, excuse me, from that. Just going quote left to right, we have former FCC Commissioner Rob McDowell and also our former Duval Award winner. We have Walter McCormick from US Telecom. We figured as everybody is talking about the demise of the landline network, you know, it'd be good to have somebody from that industry to bring a perspective. Or in the words of Buddy Hackett, I'm not dead yet. Our good friend Blair Levin, who's been with us for a long time. And of course, again, Jonathan Adelstein, who we really appreciate for PCIA for pitch hitting at this last meeting. So, the FCC is clearly at a crossroads. And so why don't we start the discussion going from, if you will, the macro to the micro, and just starting the conversation of what do you think the industry is changing? We no longer have a world of monopoly. The challenges continue. What do you think the role of the FCC should be going forward? Sort of just generically, conceptually. Why don't we start with you, Jonathan? We'll work our way that way.
Let's just start with the guy who's had no time to prepare.
Exactly.
Well, you know, the role of the FCC is really to encourage the industry to develop as quickly as possible. I mean, consumers are demanding more and more bandwidth on wireline and wireless networks, and it's very difficult for the industry to keep up in the face of regulations that don't always keep pace with the change in technology. We've seen the FCC making efforts to do that. It's very difficult to do. I mean, they need to make more spectrum available. They need to remove barriers to broadband deployment, remove barriers to infrastructure deployment. And they've actually made a major effort at doing that. At the same time, they need to encourage broadband to go to places that the market alone would not allow. For example, in rural areas, make sure that people with low incomes have access to broadband. And at the same time, I think a very light regulatory touch is in order. Sometimes, actually, you see the FCC fighting against regulations that slow broadband deployment. For example, in putting in place a shot clock, or in defining the terms of co-location by right on a wireless infrastructure. They are saying that, you know, local officials need to take into account the national priority, which is broadband deployment. Some localities are very good at that, others resist, and as a federal agency looking over the entire ecosystem, they can actually encourage, I think, a rational deployment process. So they're, in a sense, the almost a force for deployment of broadband. It's a unique situation where the regulator is in an industry where there's such a public good at stake. I mean, a lot of times you see a different situation with regulators trying to control things that might be harmful. In this case, here's an FCC that is trying to encourage something which benefits every sector of the economy. It benefits productivity, benefits efficiency, benefits healthcare, education, the list goes on and on. And so they have a role of actually encouraging that. So to the degree regulation is needed, which is extremely limited, they can do that, only where competition otherwise fails. But in general, they're taking, I think, an active role in trying to promote this and trying to modernize some of the legacy regulations to the degree they can within existing statute to make sure that that public good can be maximized.
He hasn't missed a beat.
Not one bit.
You saved mothballs really well.
I've been in formaldehyde, actually.
Well, Blair, your comments, thoughts?
I'd like the FCC be an expert agency. It's an old school kind of way of thinking about it, but I think it's, I'd like them to have an area of expertise in which they constantly provide information, data, background that is not end result oriented, but serves a process, and when called upon to make certain policy decisions, they make them based on that. I was thinking about this. I'm sure I'm the only person in the world who thought about this when Mike O'Reilly gave his testimony, and he emphasized two things. Number one, stay strong for freedom, and number two, he opposes texting and driving. And I'm just thinking, if you're really for freedom, shouldn't you be for texting, the right to text and drive? Now, I don't really want to make fun of him, but I'm just thinking, that's such a congressional way of thinking about it, because Congress as an institution is allowed to want to have its cake and eat it too. But I don't want the expert agency to think that way. I think that's a really bad way of thinking. And just to be bipartisan, we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of next month of the former chairman's speech on gigabit communities, which I think is the most amateur speech ever given by an FCC chair. An amateur, I mean, in the way that the military talks about it. The military says, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. That was a speech which was, you know, policy is fundamentally about aspiration, strategy, and execution. And that was a speech that was only about aspiration. And by the way, the aspiration of a gigabit network in every state is a silly one. But my point is, there was no strategy, there was no tactics. Nothing came out of the speech. If you think about the strategy, somehow the barrier to us having gigabit networks is that the chairman forgot to ask for them. That's ridiculous. But that was the kind of speech that, frankly, it comes out of a certain culture of the FCC that we've seen a lot of recently. It is not that of an expert agency. And I say this kind of to, in some ways, say that I think Tom Wheeler did exactly the right thing by saying, after 22 years, we ought to re-examine the technological parameters of mobile devices on planes. And everybody got all upset with him, because they don't understand the role of the expert agency, because we haven't had one articulating for a while. It is the job of the expert agency to articulate the technical parameters of spectrum as a foundation stone. If Congress wants them to ban talking on phones, that's a policy decision. Congress should have that right. Frankly, I'd rather the airlines do it than Congress, but I don't object to members of Congress doing it. I do object to members of Congress saying to the FCC that they shouldn't even look at the technical issue, because that actually is the job of the FCC. That's what they do best. That's what they should continue to do. And that's why they're an important institution going forward. And I think there are a variety of different questions that the FCC needs to be very engaged in as an expert agency first and foremost. And I might also say I was kind of disappointed that Mike O'Reilly didn't come out in favor of some jerk in an airplane talking, even though I object, because that would be standing strong for freedom. But my real point is, that's what the agency ought to be doing. Too often, that's certainly what we try to do with the broadband plan. And though we did have policy preferences, we were clear about that. And we started with a kind of factual foundation for doing those things. So what I would like to see, and by the way, I really think Tom is well aware of that, and I really honor what he was doing on mobile devices on planes. It's the right way to go.
Walter?
Well, Larry, I think that Tom Wheeler has done us a great service in his first few weeks by laying out his vision of what the FCC should be, or his focus is going to be. I can tell you, as one who had really the benefit of being able to work with Tom in his career earlier, you know, I take great interest in the fact that he was chosen by the cable industry when the industry was really in its infancy, and he promoted policies that were aimed at investment and full development of the cable industry. He then left the cable industry, he's hired by the nascent wireless industry, really for the same purposes. And he didn't leave the wireless industry until I think everybody really saw the wireless industry as having moved from being an adjunct to wireline telephone service to being an alternative to wireline telephone service. And I think that what we saw in his early comments is that he is very aware of the need to have a focus. And I think that, anytime you go into a new enterprise and you're going to have a focus and you're going to sort of structure it for the future, business consultants tell you that you have to respond to two questions. The first question is, what are we going to do? And the second question is, what are we no longer going to do? What are we not going to do? And then of the two questions, usually it's the second question that's the more difficult question, and it's the second question that too often gets ignored. And I think that what Tom Wheeler said the other day was, what we're going to focus on, we're a regulatory agency, we're going to focus on competition, we're going to focus on competition for the purpose of seeing expansion in networks. Potential for adverse consequences of just importing regulation, legacy regulation onto new services. But I would suggest that the Commission has found it difficult to decide what it's not going to any longer do in terms of deregulating. And the National Broadband Plan that Blair did, it's going on 4 or 5 years ago now, the National Broadband Plan pointed out that there was a need to ensure that legacy regulations do not become a drag on the transition to an all-IP environment. It talked about the fact that these regulations require carriers to invest in old stuff and legacy networks. And just in the course of the last few months, we've seen Anna Marie Kovacs come out with a study where she quotes Rob Atkinson as showing that from 2006 to 2011, 57% of the investment that were being made by the nation's 3 largest broadband companies was in legacy stuff that could become stranded investment. And this is as a result of legacy regulation, because if a carrier wants to build out fiber, there is a legacy requirement that you offer a voice-grade circuit. It's a TDM kind of requirement. So a lot of them leave copper in the ground. A lot of them continue to invest in TDM because there are legacy regulations that require that. So I would suggest that one of the big challenges for the FCC is to look at the fact that these legacy regulations are not only a drag on investment, but they are a drag on the FCC's own focus. Because when the FCC has to have a focus to continue to answer these kinds of questions, there's a lot of staff time, there's a lot of resources. The FCC, is now an over $300 million a year agency, 28% larger than it was in 1996. There are substantial resources that go to regulating legacy services. And let me just give you some statistics about that. So today, 1% of all IP traffic in our nation is legacy switched voice telephone service, 1%. That's not the amount of regulatory resources devoted to that. We went to the FCC and said, do you know, at a time when 45% of American households have gone wireless, at a time when 29% of voice traffic is other than landline switch, when about 1 in 4 households have landline switch traffic, we'd like you to consider voice non-dominant. Not ready to do that yet. Not ready to acknowledge that wireless is an alternative to wireline voice. There was a requirement that we keep a separate set of books called Uniform Systems of Account, separate from GAAP accounting, and that we have to keep 2 sets of books, one just for regulatory purposes. Even for companies that are no longer rate of return regulated, have to keep these uniform systems of accounts. And 5 years ago, the FCC said, you know what, don't send us that information anymore, but you continue to keep it. So after 5 years, when the FCC never asked for any of that information, we went and said, we'd like to eliminate this cost. We'll comply with GAAP accounting, but no longer keep uniform systems of accounts. The FCC, we're not ready to do that yet. So I would suggest that when the FCC looks at the industries that have become the most innovative, internet, wireless, cable, the industries that are free to invest all of their money in new things. And as a result, the industries that have become the most competitive, that one of the challenges for the FCC in promoting competition, I think, is to reduce regulation so that legacy companies don't have to spend 57% of their investment on the things that consumers aren't really interested in for the future. And this is going to be a big cultural change.
Rob?
So, and I don't mean this to be a funny line, but I want you to restate the question, because I have been listening to each of all these wonderful comments, and I want to make sure that I'm focused
Well,
on the
just,
question.
it's the initial comment of what do you think, you know, the FCC's role should be, but I will modify it to sort of move it along.
Okay.
And, you know, having sat on the 8th floor, and you've said this very often in your public speeches, the agency is there to administer Congress's will, right? You've got the statute. And we all can give multiple examples of Congress, how should we put this politely, being of two minds of wanting their cake and eating it too, right? And somebody one time asked us, well, what would a free market FCC look like? I said, well, it's impossible. Well, why? Because, well, we want competition, but we also want subsidized universal service. We also want the E-rate. We also want, the TDY people. We also want to have some must-care. We also, the list goes on. So how do you, and I think we all probably agree that major telecom overhaul is not in the cards anytime soon. How does the agency, respond to that in terms of today's environment? Because it seems to me that it's, just get rid of the, well, Congress still wants all these things. My argument is always, well, who's going to do all this? And I was wondering, sort of elaborate on that.
Well, the commission is designed by Congress to make some of these tough decisions, and whether you like the commission's results or not, we're there because Congress can't decide, let's say, universal service. Blair hated the order, but that's fine. We did something about it.
No, actually, I didn't hate the order. I hated what you said about the order.
Oh,
And I'll be happy to elaborate over
breakfast this morning, by the way.
I did.
He helps the disposition. But going forward, is this not working? No. Do I need to start over? Hi, I'm Rob McDowell. That's not working. Hello? Attention Kmart shoppers. Blue light special. We're on. Can you hear me in the back in the cheap seats? Okay, good. So, so certainly in the short term, the FCC's got to carry out Congress's intent. So that's a truism. But I think the FCC needs to be talking openly about what its future is from a very fundamental level. So you said earlier that in the short run, probably not going to be major telecom, comprehensive rewrite legislation. And that's the conventional wisdom. And it's one of the things I've been working on in my time at Hudson is trying to think through what could be done and what the time frame might be. And so, conventional wisdom says it's only going to be smaller rifle shot bills, maybe more federal spectrum, things like that. But longer term, I think the FCC has to be talking about how to reform itself. And if you think of everything, as Walter pointed out, treating different technologies based on their legacy regulation or their history, when from a consumer's perspective, it's becoming more and more seamless as to what it is what content they're getting or that they're generating and sending back up the pipe. So let's look at it from the consumer's perspective and kind of look, reverse the microscope a little bit and try to shape legislation that way. So I think the FCC really needs to be taking the lead to go out on a limb and talk very publicly with Congress about how to fundamentally reform the enabling statute. And yes, conventional wisdom is pessimistic, but I'm actually very optimistic, and in the short run, we're going to, very soon, going to see some dialogue that'll be probably a multi-year effort to do just that. And, Telecom Act 96 took maybe 12 years, depending on how you want to start counting those years. But look at it from, is there a concentration of market power? Is there abuse of that power that results in consumer harm? What can be done to improve investment? And if you look at where the most investment and innovation is today and has been for years, it's in those areas that are the least regulated. So that's only been good for consumers. It's the best time in human history to be a consumer of communication services and products right now.
So let's go back then to the Blair, did you have some real quick?
Yeah, because since you raised it, I did give a speech in which I criticized what the commissioner said about universal service reform, and I think it goes to a really important point. You said that it was a model of entitlement reform. It did not, and I think there were some good parts about the order and there were some negative parts about the order, as you would expect. But it was not a model of entitlement reform. It didn't, for example, do something that you said it's unacceptable not to do, which is contribution reform. And my point is, if you actually look at that process, it did not do exactly what you're asking now to do, which is to have an honest conversation with the public and with Congress about what we want out of universal service, what we can do, what's the most efficient way to get there. Instead, it was just a really PR-driven thing. And this, I got out of a lot of, I was reflecting in my speech, a lot of staff kind of like, they wanted us to state aspirations. It is not the job of the FCC to simply state aspirations. It is the job of the FCC to understand the aspirations, which are easy. It's the execution, which is hard. And I might say one of the most disappointing things to me about the broadband plan follow-up is that section which you're quoting, which actually was the only section, it's only one page long. It's the only one I personally typed. I get credit for writing the plan, I didn't. There were a lot of people who helped write it, but that one page I did. We should have started that process of kind of reforming how we force capital allocation to obsolete networks the day the plan was released. And you know, I'm really grateful that Tom Wheeler has said top priority, but we've lost 4 years on that. And because there was not a focus on execution, there was only a focus on articulation of aspiration, I think the agency is in deep trouble, even if they get the aspiration right, which in some ways in universal service they did, but they didn't execute right. Now, that's my problem.
Well, could there be an inherent problem in spending a year on a plan as opposed to executing right away? I mean,
What do you mean spending a year on the plan?
I mean, the FCC, the first most important thing the chairman can do when he gets in is that first year. He's hitting the ground running, starting to do policy. And instead, I was all for a broadband plan, but I found that spending a year on that, okay, it's kind of, to some extent, spinning your wheels. Everybody got really worked up about it. Everybody's fighting like hell over a plan as opposed to actual NPRM, actual policy. I mean, so the fact that it's taking this long is partly as a result of the fact of the overall sort of missing that first year boat, as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
I find that to be ironic because, in fact, the commissioners had very little. They had plenty of other things they could have been working on while we were doing the plan. Secondly, we didn't spend a year on the plan. We spent about 8 months on it. I didn't get there till June. I wasn't able to hire till August. We delivered in March.
I'm talking about the chairman. The chairman started in January.
That's a whole different subject. I'm just saying, institutionally, I think there's a lot of value to having a plan and to having a planning process. One of the things that government does very badly is plan. And the purpose of the plan is not to take, you know, the Republicans would say, oh, you're trying to take over the sector. No, it's to have a bunch of targets to shoot at and to shoot for. And one of the things we did was we kept trying to articulate things publicly very early on so that people could shoot at them. And so I think there was a very iterative process. Look, I have a lot of criticisms of how the FCC has done a number of things over the last few years. But, you know, the notion that it took a year to develop the plan, that would not be on my top 20 list.
I would say that you can certainly execute better while the plan is being done, but it took up so much focus that I think we lost it.
But that's just not
critical
true.
year.
What happened was, we delivered it in March. There was lots of stuff that was supposed to be done on the implementation. And then the court came out on the net neutrality case, and all of the energy of the 8th floor from about April to December was on net neutrality and lots of stuff on the plan. I mean, the plan was just, that's just what happened. They just didn't have the bandwidth up on the 8th floor to deal with it because it was all about net neutrality, and by then we lost a lot of critical time, which I think is a shame.
Well, let's move on. Returning back to what I think Blair's opening comment, and the question of sort of, is there a need for an expert agency? An expert agency, the concept that to me at least applies some substantive knowledge and specific, well, expertise. And there's been a lot of criticism, a lot of people saying, well, particularly in the competitive analysis, you know, whether you can go over the whole, whole 9 yards over the FCC's merger authority. But if you look at all the other areas where the FCC's got to do it, Section 10 forbearance, universal service, you still need to have this expertise, but there's still this sort of somehow, and I've heard this argument before, that somehow there's this competency problem. So Rob, let me just posit this to you because I think you're a great person to answer this question. Let's say you had an independent administrative agency, and it had a very subjective standard. In fact, there's about 30 years of literature saying how an unfair competition standard is subjective, bears no meaning of anything, and the agency decides, rather than promulgate rules, it'll just do a series of consent decrees so that nobody knows what's going on, and all of a sudden you have this rulemaking by backroom deals. Is the grass really greener over the other side of Independence Avenue? Or do we really need a generalist, or do we want somebody to sort of think about, because Congress says, well, we want competition with all these other things. I mean, is the FTC really that much better than what we have now? Or can the FCC improve itself to be more effective in that role?
Well, they're both exposed, of course, to litigation. So the FTC
Right.
has its 100th birthday next year, right? And you've got 100 years of case law just on that, what's unfair competition under the FTC Act. So that helps guide what that agency can do. Of course, it's predominantly an enforcement agency, not a rulemaking agency. So the difference the FCC has, either an advantage or disadvantage, depending on your perspective, is that it's rulemaking and enforcement. But it does focus on, consumer protection and antitrust, and in every industry in the country except for common carriage, right? So that's important. Certainly, the industries regulated by the FCC have a lot of technical issues. You want experts, to kind of build on what Blair said, you want an expert agency or folks who know what the heck's actually going on. Some of this stuff is hard to explain or understand sometimes. But at the end of the day, if you're focused on the consumer, that's, in a way, all that matters. So what's the most efficient way to do that? And that, I think, is where the discussion regarding a comprehensive rewrite should start.
I guess,
I was just going to say, go ahead, Walter.
well, I was just going to say that, the FCC is a quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial agency. It was established as a creation of Congress. Its authority is delegated from the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that there were going to be a series of issues that involved the application of such enormous time that Congress wanted to delegate this legislative authority. I think that where we are today is that our political system has evolved to a place where Congress is less capable of dealing day to day with these issues than ever before. So I would argue that there definitely is a need for an agency. But in establishing the agency, the Congress also set forth in 1934 what the purposes were.
Yeah.
And it was really the full development of communications.
Mm-hmm.
It is a telecommunications agency. It's not an internet agency. And when we look at broadband communications, when we look at the internet, when we look at the consumer issues that are now coming up, whether they're in the area of privacy, whether in the area of cybersecurity, the Commission's lack of clear authority over all other players in the internet ecosystem that are intricately tied to every aspect. I mean, if you're talking cybersecurity or privacy, there's an equipment aspect to it, there's an applications aspect to it, there's certainly a network aspect to it. And so I thought it was fascinating yesterday in his speech to Ohio State University when Tom Wheeler said what his vision of the agency is not the expert agency. It's not what he said he wanted to be. He said, as we look at the development of this new network, this next wave, I want the agency to be the people's representative. I took that to mean that it's going to be a regulatory agency, you bet. And it's also going to be an advocate. Whether that advocacy occurs, in the courts or whether it occurs on Capitol Hill, that he wants to be an agency that's sort of, in his view, the people's advocate. And I will say that historically, when you look at regulatory agencies that have faced a transition, the Civil Aeronautics Board or the Federal Trade Commission, both of which in the 1970s faced transitions under Democratic administrations. Those transitions occurred under the leadership of chairmen like, Fred Kahn or Michael Perchak at the FTC. Charlie Ferris, who not only understood the importance of being a chairman of a regulatory agency with delegated authority, but also understood the importance of being a policy leader and articulating, sort of a vision for that sector. So I think that there is a need for that. I think that there has been a vacuum in that regard. And I really am delighted to see Tom Wheeler beginning to sort of engage in that kind of a conversation by throwing some of those things out.
John? Well, I spent 15 years on Capitol Hill, so I became very aware of how statute is made. It's not pretty. Young mini-me's at 25 writing laws that later on are debated by people much older and more experienced. It's kind of scary, really. And a lot of the compromises that get made are because we couldn't get to the final level of detail, nor should we. I mean, the idea is to delegate the FCC to make the tough decisions. I think Blair's right about the expert fact is that Congress wants that done not in a political way, but to make the tough decisions, you sometimes have to do the unpopular thing. And when the FCC gets in trouble, it's often because it bows to politics and not to what is the right expert decision. Let's use the example that Blair used of cell phones and airplanes. I mean, me, and I think Rob, you were there at the time when Kevin Martin totally ducked that one because it was unpopular. He didn't want to deal with it. I thought to myself, I don't care if it's popular or unpopular, I'll take a lot of nasty calls, but if it doesn't cause harmful interference, why wouldn't we do it and let the airlines decide? Let somebody else decide. It's not our decision about it. And so now Tom made the tough decision, but what you have to do, I think, is be very careful about how you wrap that politically. It's helpful to have political experience, not to drive the policy, but to explain it. That I wouldn't have come out saying how great it is that you can have cell phones on airplanes and that wonderful technology follows you wherever you go when I first laid it out. I would say instantly, this is a hot potato. We're deciding it this way, and it's not because we want cell phones on airplanes or we think that it's great to have somebody yakking next to you. It's because that's not our decision. It would be better to present it, I think, immediately that way. I think we got to that on day 2, but on day 1, you say, we're making the technical call, and it's not about whether or not the airlines want to allow that or others want to make that decision, or whether there's, people, used to have a smoking section in the back of the plane. You have a yapping section in the back. I don't know. Not the FCC's call. Not what the statute has. And so does the sound, too. So, they have to decide. That's not the FCC's decision. The FCC's decision is a simple one of does it cause harmful interference, basically, to the towers on Earth. And so they made the right call. I'm not sure it was sold as well as it could. Now we're trying to sell it that way. But that's a good example of when you let politics happen. This decision was deferred for many years because politics got in the way of an expert agency making what I think was ultimately the right decision.
Well, let me ask this final question, because we've all touched on this. And the politics involved in telecoms, I'm shocked. I say shocked. It always was and will be. But I would probably submit that over the last 7, 8 years, I think the agency has become far more politicized than I've ever seen. It's really gotten bad where, thousands of, email comments come in. I don't like this rule. And you go, look, I got the weight of the evidence. I got 30,000 email comments. What can we do? I realize, policy is personnel. What can we do under the current constraints that we're all operating under to improve the process? Are there procedural things we can do? Are there cultural things that we can do? What is it that we can do to help make the agency, if it is, whatever that role is, relevant and important and it's discreet in its job? So, Rob, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, first of all, if I could just say as a threshold matter, we've talked a lot about some potential deregulatory initiatives, the IP transition, cell phones on planes and all the rest. I'm going to find it hard to believe. We'll be pleasantly surprised if 3 years from now we will look back net on the Wheeler Commission and say that it was deregulatory net. I think it'll be more regulatory. So just keep that in mind. But I think the FCC could start by doing things like market studies. This was a big frustration of mine are things like net neutrality. FCC never conducted a bona fide market study at all. Special access, we tried since about '07 to get a market study. And there's something underway now. I'm not quite sure what will end up happening there. But, so, before you regulate, let's find out, is there a market failure that actually needs curing? And if so, what's the best way to cure it? Is that sunset it? So sunset of rules, I think could also be helpful. Starting with NOIs.
Rob McDowell quote, the valley of unattained goals in all of it.
Certainly, starting with NOIs and market studies before you go to an NPRM, which should have proposed rules more often than not, and sticking to the process that works. But you also, though, need to respect the forbearance process, Section 10, and it does in Section 11 as well. Walter's members have to maintain 2 books for accounting purposes. That should have been gotten rid of a long time ago, long before I got to the FCC, but it's still there. Why is that? So there's a lot that can be done.
I think a lot of it too has to do with sort of the personality of the chairman and leadership. I think that Tom Wheeler, in every speech that he's given so far, he's mentioned that he's one of 5 commissioners and he's working with these other commissioners. That goes a long way. I will tell you, last summer I was very impressed with Commissioner Clyburn during the period of being acting chairman, because we had, in the middle of the summer, we had a real contentious issue with regard to universal service. And we had the commissioners come over and speak to our board, all of the sitting commissioners. And it was remarkable to me, the level of dialogue that had occurred among the 3 of them during that interim period. How there was a sense that they were working collaboratively and together.
You can work better with 3.
And there were some real accomplishments during that period that I think helped with investment deployment of broadband. So I think a lot of it does come to sort of the leadership and personality of the chair.
I second the praise of Interim Chair Clyburn. She did a great job, I thought, for a lot of different, very active, very engaged.
5 minutes. We do a lot of praising. So.
Well deserving of the award. So this is the pre-praise. Oh, she's there. I had no idea. So actually, seriously, I didn't.
You criticize ex-commissioners very easily.
Secondly, I think Tom is doing a great job providing that kind of leadership. One thing I will say that we tried to do with the plan that I'm sorry the Commission did not adopt as a normal policy. We, in the September '09 meeting, about a month after we got into staff, we held this 4-hour-long meeting, which I'm not suggesting 4-hour-long meetings, but basically where we laid the factual predicate for all the rest of the work we were about to do. And I think it would be very valuable. The Commission knows, roughly speaking, 3 to 6 months in advance what items will be coming up. I think it would be very valuable for the public if staff were to lay out, either in a public meeting or in some other way, what the factual predicate is for the decision making. Because then you can have it debated, and the debate will be much more, will be less hypothetical, and be more fact-based. And I think that there's real value to that, and I hope that the Commission adopts some way of helping people understand the context. If you're going to reach a decision in April, you ought to have some notion of both kind of what underlies it in January or February.
John?
Oh, wait.
This chairman is really showing that I think it is a lot about the chairman. He's doing an amazing job early on, as did Commissioner Clyburn during her, Chairman Clyburn during her time, of course. She got a lot of good stuff done. You can act, or you can kind of sit back and put your finger to the wind and decide. And we saw some of that when I was a commissioner, and I think that I'm already hearing from the staff that decisions are being made in briefing meetings. I mean, things are moving in a way that they weren't used to, and they're very, I think, thrilled about it, energized by it. This is going to be a much more, I think, dynamic commission. The industry wants certainty. They want decisions. It may not always go their way, but they feel like they were heard, and a decision was made fairly based on the statute and the merits. Even if it didn't quite go their way, I think people understand that, and they will adjust to the rules of the road, and they'll adjust their business models. But when there's sort of deliberation that goes on endlessly, and a lack of that kind of certainty, it undermines the ability of people to invest. as a former sort of federal banker, we needed to know with certainty what the rules were. I think that we're going to see under this chairman a level of productivity that the industry is going to welcome in terms of having some finality on these decisions and moving forward and getting the staff to be able to really provide their expert counsel and to act on it quickly, because the chairman himself isn't such an expert and somebody who's also so familiar with the issues that industry faces day to day, having been in it, having represented it for so long.
Rob?
Two quick things. So first of all, absolutely, the personalities of the people who fill those 5 chairs shape outcomes more than they want to. And it's absolutely true. It's fascinating. Each commission could be a own sort of business case study as to how personalities shape the sort of organizational behavior. Second, completely unrelated, as we segue into the much-deserved Jerry B. Duvall Award to Chairman McDowell Clyburn, my friend and former colleague, I want Jerry to answer the question of what is it like to have an award named after you while you're still living? I just, you can add
It's the Buddy Hackett again. I'm not dead yet.
Can I point out, that wasn't Buddy Hackett, it was Mark Twain who said, reports of my death are greatly exaggerated.
That was Monty Python.
And
That was actually Buddy Hackett that picked it up.
Buddy Hackett picked it up. But here's the thing people keep forgetting when they quote that. Mark Twain is now dead. I mean, it happens eventually.
Well, I will explain why we named it after Jerry as I make the presentation. Well, guys, I really appreciate it. It was an excellent conversation. Jonathan, again, thank you so much for pitching. I was going to pitch you a softball one, and we believe in Section 253 by, preempting states who are blocking policy-relevant barriers to entry, like pole attachments and tower siting, which is a very valid role for the FCC there. So I did pitch you a total softball for jumping into the last minute. Well, gentlemen, again, thank you all so much. No colleges bringing up again, particularly because George went to Auburn, and our economics staff's at Auburn, and it's been a hell of a 2 days. Incorrigible. So let us proceed now over to Commissioner Clyburn. Thank you guys so much. You're welcome to sit down.